Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Consider this scenario. Your empire, a 250-year-old superpower dominating the river valleys of Southeast Asia, is staring down the deadliest, most sophisticated war machine in human history.
Right, the Mongols are literally at the gates.
Exactly. They have leveled civilizations from Eastern Europe to the Korean Peninsula, and your king's primary concern, making sure he finishes his daily quota of 300 dishes of curry.
It is a very specific priority.
It really is. So we are launching into a deep dive into the source material on the Mongol invasions of Burma. The mission today is to explore exactly how the pagan empire, a massive, wealthy state, rapidly disintegrated in the late 13th century.
In the historical records we are looking at today, which include Burmese chronicles, contemporary stone inscriptions, and tactical breakdowns of medieval warfare, reveal something crucial.
Right, because this empire did not collapse solely because the Mongol Yuan dynasty showed up. It collapsed because the empire was already crumbling under the weight of its own internal systemic rot.
Yes, the Mongol invasion simply acted as the final sledgehammer to a deeply flawed foundation.
And the stakes of this collapse are monumental. We are going to see how a border dispute over a few mountain passes eventually triggers a massive demographic domino effect.
A domino effect that physically redraws the ethnic map of mainland Southeast Asia.
It is a profound case study in how complex systems fail. I mean, we often look for a single catastrophic event to explain the end of an era.
But when analyzing the pagan empire, the evidence points to a slow-motion economic and political decay. One that lasted for decades before a single Mongol arrow was fired.
So to understand the collapse, we must first dissect the mechanics of that internal rot. Let us establish the setting. The year is 1250.
Roughly 3 decades before the main invasions begin.
Yeah, we are in the sprawling golden city of Pagan, located in the central dry zone of modern-day Myanmar, right along the Irrawaddy River.
And you have thousands upon thousands of intricate Buddhist temples, pagodas, and monasteries rising from the dusty plains.
The skyline is heavily gilded. It projects an image of immense, unshakable wealth and profound religious devotion.
But that very skyline, that massive concentration of religious architecture, is actually obscuring a fatal economic reality.
The empire was quite literally bankrupting itself through its own piety.
Exactly. The mechanism of this decline is deeply tied to the economic realities of merit-making in Theravada Buddhism.
Right.
So the pagan empire, founded back in the 9th century, reached its zenith under King Anuradha in the 11th century.
He unified the region and established the state as a major patron of Theravada Buddhism.
Yeah, and for generations following his reign, pagan kings, the royal family, and the nobility secured their political legitimacy and spiritual merit for future reincarnations by donating land.
Specifically, they donated vast tracts of highly productive agricultural land to the Buddhist Sangha, which is the clergy.
I need to stop you right there because I want to look at the mechanics of this.
Sure.
I often think of this like a modern corporation where the philanthropic wing accidentally defunds the primary operating budget.
That is a very apt comparison. They are giving away the core assets to a tax-exempt entity.
But wait, if the Sangha owned the land, why couldn't the king just tax the harvest itself?
Or tax the peasants working the land.
Yeah, why was giving away the dirt the same as giving away the entire economy?
Well, that goes to the heart of medieval Burmese property law and religious custom. When land was donated to the Sangha, it was formally consecrated.
I see.
The land, the water rights, the peasants assigned to work it, and the entirety of the agricultural output became tax-exempt in perpetuity.
In perpetuity. So the state surrendered all fiscal claims entirely.
Yes.
The unintended economic consequence of this constant generational merit-making was staggering.
By the eve of the Mongol invasions, historians calculate that between 1/3 and 2/3 of Upper Burma's cultivable land was owned entirely by the clergy,
Which completely starved the secular crown of revenue.
To govern effectively in the central dry zone of Burma, the crown required massive resources to maintain the intricate irrigation networks. We are talking about extensive systems of weirs and canals.
Specifically in the Kayaks district, known as the 11 Kuruan and the Minbu district.
These were the primary granaries of the empire.
Right. Without tax revenue from the agricultural output, the state could not dredge the canals. They could not pay loyal courtiers to prevent regional rebellions.
And most importantly, they could not afford to raise, feed, or equip a large standing army.
The more pious the empire became, the weaker the state machinery grew.
You are describing a slow-moving administrative catastrophe. If the pagan kings knew this was bankrupting the state, why couldn't they just take the land back?
If the survival of the empire is at stake, surely a king has the absolute authority to just seize the land, repurpose the harvest, and fund the military.
If we look at the physical reality of how a king justified his rule in medieval Southeast Asia, we see why that was virtually impossible.
The king's right to rule was not merely secular. It was divinely sanctioned through his specific role as the chief patron and protector of the Buddhist faith.
To seize land from the Sangha, to strip the monasteries of their wealth, would be to destroy the king's own spiritual legitimacy.
It would be viewed as a deeply sacrilegious act.
Exactly. A king who attacked the Sangha would immediately alienate the very institutions that told the populace he was fit to rule,
Instantly courting public rebellion.
Kings did occasionally try to purge the clergy of corrupt monks or audit the land records to reclaim some resources, but these efforts were largely superficial.
They were trapped by their own ideological system.
That structural trap perfectly sets up the leadership at the time the crisis hits.
Enter King Narathihapat, also known as Sithu IV.
The Burmese chronicles characterize him as arrogant, volatile, and famously the swallower of 300 dishes of curry daily.
He's depicted as a deeply paranoid leader who alienated his most experienced military commanders and ministers.
He seems entirely unsuited to navigate a complex geopolitical crisis.
The chronicles certainly vilify him. While some of that may be retroactive blame applied by later historians trying to explain the fall of the empire, his documented actions demonstrate a severe lack of diplomatic foresight.
He was deeply unpopular, constantly diverting what little resources the state had to put down internal rebellions from vassal states in the south.
However, he did have a stabilizing counterbalance in his inner circle, Queen Kwasaw.
She is a fascinating historical figure, a commoner who rose to become the chief consort, known for her sharp intellect and political acumen.
The sources note she actively managed the king's destructive impulses.
There is a specific account of her using a wooden charm to talk him out of impulsive executions when his paranoia flared up.
She was essentially the strategic anchor holding the royal court together, trying to govern a bankrupt state while the king indulged his appetite.
She was a highly educated and pragmatic power broker. While the king alienated his experienced ministers, like the formidable commander Yazathingyan,
Queen Kwasaw was the one pleading for their reinstatement to manage the state's collapsing frontiers.
the internal decay of Pagan, the economic starvation from the tax-free land grants, and this volatile leadership at the top set the stage perfectly.
But it was an external geopolitical shift of unprecedented magnitude that actually ignited the powder keg.
That external shift arrived in the form of the Mongol Empire expanding southward. In 1253, the Mongols conquered the Dali Kingdom,
Which is located in modern-day Yunnan, China.
This is a massive turning point. For centuries, the Dali Kingdom, with its formidable mountainous terrain, had acted as a geographic and political buffer state between Burma and Imperial China.
Now that buffer was gone, creating the first direct shared border between the expanding Mongol war machine and the pagan empire.
This brings us to 1271. Emperor Kublai Khan formally founded the Yunnan dynasty in China.
His primary strategic goal was the encirclement and destruction of the remnants of the southern Song dynasty.
To achieve this, he needed to secure his deep southern borders, eliminate any potential escape routes for Song refugees, and ensure his supply lines were unthreatened.
He sent envoys south, demanding tribute from the pagan empire.
Let us examine the word tribute because it carries a lot of baggage.
Under the traditional Sino-centric system, like the one operating during the Tang or Song dynasties, tribute was often a highly symbolic economic exchange, correct?
Under the traditional tributary system, states in Southeast Asia would send envoys to the Chinese court carrying local goods.
War elephants, rhinoceros horns, rare woods, and gems.
In exchange, the Chinese emperor would bestow lavish gifts of silk and porcelain, grant them highly lucrative trading rights within Chinese ports, and offer diplomatic recognition.
It was essentially a framework for international trade disguised as a hierarchy. The vassal states retained total sovereignty over their internal affairs.
The Chinese court viewed it as a recognition of their cultural centrality, while the Southeast Asian rulers viewed it as a practical, highly profitable business arrangement.
The Mongols, however, fundamentally changed the rules of that arrangement.
The Mongol version of tribute was not about symbolic trade or polite diplomatic fictions. It demanded absolute physical political submission.
When Kublai Khan demanded tribute, he meant relinquishing sovereignty.
The Mongols required vassal states to send royal family members to Beijing as hostages
To supply vast quotas of conscripted troops for future Mongol campaigns.
and to allow the installation of Mongol-backed resident administrators known as Darachi.
These administrators would integrate the vassal state into the Mongol postal and tax systems. They demanded deep, extractive administrative integration.
So when the envoys arrived in Pagan in 1271 demanding tribute, Narathipada wasn't just turning down a silk for elephants trade deal.
He was being asked to hand over his kingdom's autonomy.
He refused the demand, and he didn't just issue a polite refusal, he kept the imperial envoys waiting for weeks in the capital,
Subjecting them to severe diplomatic humiliation.
His ministers, acutely aware of the Mongol military might gathering in Yunnan, eventually had to devise a compromise.
They sent the envoys back with a vaguely worded letter just to get them out of the capital before the volatile king ordered something drastic.
That delay tactic did not solve the structural problem. In 1273, Kublai Khan dispatched a second delegation.
This time, the demand was explicit and carried an ultimatum.
The envoys carried a letter from the emperor demanding that the king send royal family members to Beijing to enter into a perpetual alliance,
Explicitly threatening an invasion if Pagan refused.
The historical record gets quite murky here, but it is undeniably dramatic. The Burmese chronicles claim that King Narathihabit was so deeply insulted by this demand that he had the imperial envoys executed on the spot.
Modern historiography, relying on contemporary stone inscriptions and the Yuan dynasty's own highly meticulous administrative records, paints a different picture.
The evidence suggests the envoys may have simply vanished on the dangerous, poorly maintained roads between Pagan and Yunnan.
The region was highly unstable, filled with bandits and local rebellions.
The Yuan government, at the time, merely noted that the envoys did not return and sent an armed search party,
Which could not penetrate the borderlands due to heavy local resistance.
Regardless of whether Narathihabit personally ordered their execution or if they fell victim to the chaotic frontier, his subsequent military actions made his political stance clear.
He sent army expeditions to forcibly reclaim disputed borderlands that had independently submitted to the Mongols.
You are probably wondering why a king commanding a financially starved, politically fractured state would actively provoke the largest continuous land empire in human history.
Was Narathihabit just blindingly arrogant, or did he have a strategic rationale?
If we analyze the geopolitical landscape of the 1270s, he likely made a calculated, albeit disastrous, assessment of Mongol bandwidth.
The Mongols were massively preoccupied. Kublai Khan was committing vast amounts of men, treasure, and logistical resources to the grueling attritional conquest of the southern Song dynasty.
A campaign that would not conclude until 1279.
Furthermore, the Mongols were recovering from a deeply humiliating and catastrophic failed naval invasion of Japan in 1274.
Narathihabit likely calculated that the Yuan dynasty simply could not afford to divert a massive imperial army into the dense malarial borderlands of Southeast Asia.
He assumed he was triggering a minor frontier skirmish over a few remote mountain passes.
Not inviting the full weight of an imperial invasion.
That calculation proved to be a fatal error, leading directly to the first major military collision between traditional Southeast Asian warfare and the Mongol military machine.
The border war of 1277 to 1278 centers entirely on the Battle of Gasavangin.
In April 1277, the Burmese army marched north to reclaim a mountainous vassal state known as the Golden Teeth, located in modern-day Xinjiang.
This state had recently submitted to the Mongols, who had placed a garrison there to guard the mountain passes.
This garrison was commanded by an experienced Mongol officer named Kutuk.
We should note that Marco Polo's famous account of this battle mistakenly names the commander Nasir al-Din,
who actually led a subsequent raid later that year. But Polo's tactical description of the fighting remains highly instructive.
Let us examine the sheer contrast in military cultures preparing to clash on this field.
Picture the Burmese advance. Moving out of the tree line and onto the plains is a massive wall of war elephants.
The sources describe these elephants as heavily armored, with their flanks protected by thick plating.
Strapped to their backs are large, strongly framed wooden towers,
each carrying 12 to 16 well-armed fighting men, primarily archers and spearmen.
Following behind this imposing vanguard of armored giants is the Burmese cavalry, and then tens of thousands of infantry.
But the vast majority of that infantry were not professional soldiers. They were unarmored peasant levies, forcibly conscripted from the agricultural heartland.
Carrying basic weapons, they are marching in dense formations, preparing to charge.
Facing them is a significantly smaller but highly professional Mongol force.
Polo's numbers claim 12,000 Mongols against 60,000 Burmese.
Modern military historians suggest the ratio was likely closer to a few thousand elite Mongol and Turkic cavalry against perhaps 10 to 20,000 Burmese.
The core of the Yuan force was heavy and light cavalry, armed with the devastating composite bow.
I want to break down the mechanics of this initial contact because the conventional wisdom is that Mongol cavalry crushes everything.
But that is not what happened in the opening minutes of this battle.
The initial phase nearly resulted in a complete Mongol rout. As the Burmese war elephants trumpeted, crashed through the brush, and began their charge, the Mongol and Turkic horses panicked completely.
Horses are prey animals, and they were entirely unaccustomed to the colossal size, the unnatural metallic clanking of the armor, and the overwhelming scent of the elephants.
The horses reared up, swerved violently, and refused to face the enemy lines.
The Mongol cavalry formation, normally renowned for its iron discipline, began to waver and break before the battle had even truly commenced.
Kutuk, watching his cavalry line about to shatter, makes a brilliant, highly adaptive tactical decision.
He orders his forces to retreat into the dense nearby tree line.
He orders his elite cavalrymen to dismount, tie their horses' reins to the heavy timber, and march back out onto the plain on foot.
Armed only with their composite bows.
To transition from a highly mobile mounted force to static, heavy infantry archers in the middle of an enemy charge requires immense training and rigid command structure.
It neutralized the elephants' ability to easily trample them, as the dense trees prevented the elephants from penetrating the Mongol position.
Let us look at the mechanics of the composite bow in this specific scenario. The Mongols unleash a relentless, concentrated shower of arrows.
Now, the composite bow made of laminated horn, wood, and sinew has a terrifying draw weight and armor-piercing capability.
But against thick elephant hide draped in metal plating, those arrows are not scoring clean kills.
They could not deeply penetrate the heavy armor, protecting the vital organs of the elephants.
But scoring clean kills was not the objective. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the barrage, the constant stinging of arrows finding gaps in the armor, the deafening noise of the impacts,
and the pain inflicted on the exposed areas like the trunks and legs threw the animals into a state of blind, uncontrollable panic.
You can think of an elephant in panic like a modern armored tank suddenly having its steering wheel invert while the accelerator is stuck to the floor.
The Burmese archers up in their wooden towers are violently swaying, desperately trying to return fire.
But they cannot match the rate or accuracy of the Mongol archers massed in the trees.
The elephants realize they want absolutely no part of this arrow storm.
The turning point occurs when the elephants completely break their forward momentum. They wheel around and stampede away from the tree line.
The disastrous problem for the Burmese is that retreating meant charging directly back through their own tightly packed lines.
The rampaging elephants shattered the Burmese cavalry formations waiting behind them and completely crushed the ranks of their own unarmored infantry levies.
The cohesion of the Burmese army collapsed instantly under the weight of their own vanguard.
Kutuk does not hesitate for a second. Once the elephants clear the field and the Burmese lines are a chaotic mess, he orders his men to fall back into the trees.
Untie their horses, remount, and launch a sweeping general cavalry charge into the broken ranks of the Burmese infantry.
The resulting melee was fierce and lasted much of the afternoon. The Burmese infantry fought back with remarkable bravery,
managing to unhorse and kill many Mongols in brutal close-quarters combat.
However, the heavy armor of the Yuan cavalry and their superior mobility allowed them to repeatedly charge, strike, and withdraw,
systematically wearing down the unarmored Burmese foot soldiers.
By late afternoon, the Burmese lines broke entirely, leading to a disorganized general retreat.
As is typical in medieval warfare, the vast majority of casualties occurred during this rout, as the light cavalry ran down the fleeing infantry.
The Battle of Nungasonggen was a clear tactical victory for the Yuan dynasty, but it was not a flawless sweep.
The sources specifically note the heavy toll. Kutuk himself was badly wounded in the fighting.
The Yuan forces suffered significant casualties and were in no logistical condition to pursue the retreating Burmese army deep into the unfamiliar malarial territory of the Irrawaddy Valley.
They held the border and then withdrew back to the cooler climate of Yunnan.
Strategically, this battle should have served as a massive, glaring warning sign for both empires.
For the Burmese military establishment, it proved that their traditional elephant-centric warfare doctrine was highly vulnerable to disciplined massed archers.
And that relying on peasant levies to hold lines against heavy cavalry was suicidal.
For Kublai Khan, it was a warning that the Burmese would not simply capitulate to demands.
That they would fight fiercely in close combat, and that the rugged terrain and tropical climate would exact a heavy toll on his armies.
That strategic warning went entirely unheeded by Kublai Khan, because a few years later, the geopolitical board shifted again.
By 1281, the southern Song dynasty had completely fallen. Kublai Khan had consolidated his grip on the entirety of China.
However, he had also suffered another massive, humiliating defeat trying to invade Japan.
His imperial prestige required a decisive, undeniable victory, so he turned his full, undivided military apparatus southward.
He issued sweeping demands for tribute and submission, not just from Pagan, but from the Khmer Empire, Daviet, and Champa.
King Narathiapate again chose defiance. The Mongol court required him to send 10 senior government ministers and 1,000 elite cavalry to Beijing as a sign of submission.
The Pagan court, perhaps clinging to the delusion that this would merely result in another limited border clash, refused the demands outright.
They fundamentally misunderstood the scale of what was coming. In 1283, Kublai Khan ordered a massive, coordinated imperial invasion of Southeast Asia.
This was not a border garrison. This was a Yuan force incorporating 10,000 battle-hardened troops from Sichuan,
Alongside 14,000 Persian and Central Asian siege engineers and infantry.
all marching on Burma under the command of Prince Senkwidar.
They advanced along multiple land routes and utilized a fleet of over 200 boats to control the riverways.
The Burmese commanders, two brothers named Anandapisi and Yandapisi, were tasked with halting this juggernaut.
Knowing their forces were severely outnumbered and outclassed in open combat, they adopted a rigid strategy of static defense in depth.
They heavily fortified the northern border outposts at Nigasongyan and Kongsan.
They constructed massive earthen ramparts, deep water-filled moats, and extensive layered wooden stockades.
They utilized the naturally difficult bottleneck terrain to neutralize the Mongol cavalry's mobility.
Their tactical goal was not to defeat the Mongols in a pitched battle, but to stall them indefinitely.
You were probably wondering why a commander would voluntarily lock his army inside a static fortress against the greatest siege engineers of the medieval era.
In Vietnam, forces facing the Mongols famously abandoned their cities, used the dense jungle for hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, and let the environment starve the Mongols out.
Why did the Burmese commanders choose to build walls instead of fighting in the jungle?
It seems highly counterintuitive until you look at the internal political reality of the pagan empire at that exact moment.
Remember the severe unpopularity of King Narathiapate. The empire was actively fracturing from within.
Rebellions were constant in the southern and eastern provinces.
If the Burmese army had dispersed into the jungles to wage a decentralized guerrilla war, they would have had to rely entirely on the local populace for food, intelligence, and shelter.
Because the crown had aggressively alienated its own people, the generals simply could not trust the local villagers not to betray them, deny them supplies, or actively join the Mongols.
They did not possess the political capital required to sustain an insurgency.
They were forced to rely on conventional strongholds where they could maintain strict command and control over their own troops.
Furthermore, they were banking heavily on the environment. They hoped the intense, debilitating heat of the tropical climate combined with malaria would break the siege and decimate the Mongol ranks before the fortress walls fell.
The Mongols, however, were well aware of the climate clock ticking against them. Prince Senkwidar did not engage in a slow, passive blockade.
He launched relentless, highly coordinated waves of attacks. The Mongols deployed their full suite of siege technology.
Sophisticated incendiaries, heavy stone throwers to shatter the wooden stockades, and massive, disciplined infantry assaults to bridge the moats.
The siege of Nigasongyan was grueling, lasting over 2 months of continuous combat.
The Burmese defenders fought with immense desperation. The deep moats initially bogged down the Yuan infantry.
But the sheer volume of troops and the relentless round-the-clock bombardment eventually overwhelmed the defenses.
The primary fort at Ngzongyan fell in early December 1283.
Just 6 days later, the secondary fortress at Kongsan fell, with UN military records claiming 10,000 Burmese casualties.
The northern defensive line was completely shattered.
The Mongol forces immediately pushed south along the Irrawaddy River Valley. They captured the ancient, culturally significant city of Tagong in early 1284.
And then the physical environment finally accomplished what the Burmese army could not.
The intense heat of the approaching Burmese summer became so excessive, and disease began spreading so rapidly through the ranks that the Mongols evacuated Tagong.
And retreated north to cooler, higher ground in Yunnan to recover.
The respite for the pagan empire was merely temporary. Once the monsoon season ended, the Mongols returned in force during the dry season of late 1284 and early 1285.
They effortlessly retook Tagong and crushed another desperate Burmese defensive stand near Hanlin.
The road to the capital city of Pagan, situated just 270 kilometers away across relatively open terrain, was completely undefended.
When the news of the advancing, unstoppable Mongol army reached the golden city of Pagan, King Narathihapat panicked entirely.
He abandoned his capital, his ancestral palaces, and the thousands of temples his dynasty had built,
Fleeing hundreds of miles south to the region of Prom.
This frantic flight destroyed whatever final shred of legitimacy he still possessed.
He earned a permanent, deeply humiliating nickname in Burmese history.
Tayok Piman, the king who ran away from the Chinese.
His flight signaled the total collapse of central administrative authority.
The king's arrival in the southern provinces did not inspire a unified resistance. It inspired raw political opportunity.
Massive internal rebellions immediately erupted across the territory. The eastern half of Lower Burma, including major economic hubs like Pegu and Martaban, rose in open, armed revolt.
Long-standing vassal states severed their ties. The 250-year-old empire fractured instantly into chaotic fiefdoms.
The king finds himself isolated in the south, surrounded by hostile, rebellious sons and heavily armed former vassals.
He finally accepts that the war is irrevocably lost.
In 1286, he attempts to sue for peace.
He sends a diplomatic embassy, led by a highly respected, deeply learned Buddhist monk named Shinditha Pamok.
On the grueling, months-long journey all the way to Kublai Khan's court in Beijing.
The terms dictated by the emperor were brutal, officially extinguishing pagan sovereignty.
The delegation formally acknowledged absolute Mongol suzerainty over the entirety of the pagan empire.
They agreed to pay a heavy annual tribute, consisting of vital agricultural goods, which would be managed by the Yuan provincial government in Yunnan.
In exchange, Kublai Khan, whose other military campaigns in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam and Java, were suffering catastrophic logistical failures, agreed to halt the invasion and withdraw his frontline troops from northern Burma.
The emperor calculated that having a compliant, legally bound vassal ruler was far more cost-effective than investing massive resources into permanently occupying a hostile, disease-ridden, and politically shattered landscape.
Believing his throne was finally secure under the legal protection of the Mongol Treaty, Narathihapat made the decision to march back north toward Pagan in 1287 to reclaim his empty capital.
Queen Poisson explicitly warned him against this. She understood the political reality on the ground.
She advised him to remain in the south, raise a massive loyal army first, and above all, to entirely avoid the territory of Prom,
which was currently governed by his deeply hostile, ambitious second son, Prince Thiathu.
He ignored her political calculus completely. Demonstrating the same lack of judgment that started the war, he marched with only a small royal retinue directly into Prom.
Prince Thiathu's forces promptly intercepted and seized the king.
According to the historical chronicles, the prince presented his captive father with a grim, theatrical choice.
Die a bloody death by the sword, or eat a heavily poisoned meal.
The king, remembering his famous daily quota of curries, chose the food. He reportedly wept uncontrollably over his final meal, sobbing as he ate the poisoned dishes.
He died a pitiful, highly undignified death. And with his assassination, the pagan empire officially ceased to exist as a functional state.
The tributary treaty he had just signed in Beijing was rendered completely void,
because there was no sovereign left alive with the authority to enforce it.
The central state atomized into numerous small, fiercely competing military power centers. This chaotic vacuum brings us to one of the most significant and contested historiographical debates regarding the Mongol invasions.
What exactly happened after the king's assassination?
The traditional colonial-era scholarship, spearheaded by historians like G.E. Harvey, maintained that upon hearing of the king's death and the voiding of the treaty, the Mongol forces stationed in the northern garrisons ignored direct imperial orders from Beijing to withdraw.
According to this traditional narrative, these rogue commanders fought their way south through heavy resistance, losing 7,000 men in the process.
and actually breached and sacked the Golden City of Pagan in 1287, sending raiding detachments even further south.
Let's look closely at that narrative, because it has been strongly challenged by more recent historical analysis.
It has been thoroughly deconstructed. Modern scholarship, particularly the extensive work by historian Michael Ong Thwin, argues compellingly that the Mongols most likely never reached the city of Pagan.
There is absolutely no mention of the city's capture or looting in contemporary Mongol or Chinese military records.
This is a glaring omission, as the Yuan administrative state meticulously prized listing its conquests and the specific wealth extracted from fallen capitals.
The modern historical consensus suggests the Mongols pushed south to secure their perimeter, but were halted about 160 kilometers north of Pagan by an entirely new, highly effective military power that had emerged from the chaos.
And this new power was not a royal heir of the pagan bloodline attempting to restore the dynasty.
It was three common-born military commanders who stepped into the massive power vacuum left by the dead king.
This marks the rise of the three brothers, Athinkaya, Yazathinian, and Thiatu.
These three brothers were battle-tested commanders who controlled a relatively small but highly disciplined and fiercely loyal army.
During the total administrative collapse of 1287, while the surviving royal family fled into exile or fought each other in petty skirmishes, these brothers manned the northern defenses.
They are credited with holding off the advancing Mongol detachments and forcing them to fall back to their fortified positions at Dagon.
The crucial point is that they didn't just hold a military line. They executed a brilliant, ruthless geopolitical maneuver regarding the economy.
They consolidated their absolute military control over the Kyaukse district. We discussed this earlier.
Kyaukse is the 11 Kuruman, the most crucial, extensively irrigated granary of the entire central dry zone.
By controlling the complex network of weirs and canals, they controlled the rice harvest.
By controlling the food supply, they controlled central Burma.
Without the output of Kyaukse, no rival faction could feed an army or sustain a siege in the dry zone.
It was a masterstroke of prioritizing logistical realities over royal lineage. They held all the functional power.
They possessed the only organized, combat-ready army in the region, and they possessed the calories required to sustain it.
If these brothers held all the military and economic power, why didn't they just formally crown themselves kings immediately?
Why bother maintaining the facade of the old, failed dynasty?
They understood the immense, lingering currency of political legitimacy. The deep-seated cultural reverence for the pagan royal bloodline remained powerful among the general populace.
The surviving provincial lords and the religious establishment still viewed the pagan dynasty as divinely mandated to rule.
If the common-born brothers simply usurped the throne outright, they would instantly invite endless, unified rebellion from every other warlord claiming to defend the true king.
Instead, they chose to operate behind a carefully constructed facade of legitimacy.
They allowed a surviving son of Narathihapat, a weak figure named Kyawswa, to be formally crowned king in 1289.
Kyawswa was a king in name only. His actual authority extended barely past the physical walls of Pagan City.
The brothers acted as his viceroys, but in everyday reality, they were the absolute sovereigns of the region.
And navigating this incredibly tense, dangerous political arrangement was none other than Queen Ploss Sa.
She remained a critical, central power broker in the post-collapse landscape.
She clearly understood that the legitimate royal heirs were militarily weak, and the illegitimate brothers were militarily powerful.
She utilized her immense diplomatic experience to maintain a fragile balance, preserving the religious and cultural symbols of the pagan dynasty while quietly acknowledging the martial reality of the brothers' role.
But the youngest and most ambitious of the three brothers, Thiatu, was not content with playing the quiet background viceroy.
He began openly adopting highly restricted royal titles. By 1295, he audaciously took the title Lord of the White Elephant, a designation strictly reserved for sovereign monarchs.
By 1296, he was openly styling himself Great King.
Feeling the political walls closing in and realizing his execution was likely imminent, the puppet king Kyawswa made a desperate, incredibly high-stakes geopolitical play.
In January 1297, he secretly sent his son to the Mongol garrison stationed in the north and officially pledged direct fealty to the Yuan dynasty.
He was gambling that Emperor Timur Khan, who had succeeded Kublai Khan, would officially recognize him as the rightful, legitimate king and deploy the Mongol army to protect him from the overreaching brothers.
In March 1297, the emperor officially recognized Kyawswa's submission and, adding insult to injury, issued the brothers subordinate Chinese administrative titles, legally demoting them.
The brothers were not going to accept being legally demoted by a powerless puppet king backed by a distant emperor.
They decided to risk the full wrath of the Mongol military machine.
They orchestrated a swift, bloodless coup with the explicit, quiet assistance of Queen Poisson, who had finally calculated that her ineffective stepson was a liability to regional stability.
In December 1297, the brothers invited Kyawswa to attend a lavish dedication ceremony for a newly constructed monastery in their heavily fortified stronghold of Maisang.
Relying on the religious nature of the event for safety, Kyawswa attended.
As soon as the religious ceremony concluded, he was immediately surrounded, arrested, instantly dethroned, and forcibly ordained as a monk to strip him of his royal status.
A few years later, in 1299, to permanently eliminate any rallying point for loyalists or the Mongols, the brothers had Kyawswa and his primary heir executed.
Executing a federally recognized sworn vassal of the Mongol Empire is not an administrative oversight you can sweep under the rug.
It was an act of open, undeniable defiance against the Yuan court.
Emperor Timur Khan could not let that stand without shattering Mongol prestige across the entire region.
The brothers, knowing war was inevitable, pushed even further, launching preemptive attacks on lightly manned Mongol garrisons in northern Burma in January 1300.
That aggressive provocation triggered the final major military conflict of this era.
In June 1300, the Yuan emperor ordered a second massive invasion force to permanently punish the brothers and install another surviving, compliant son of Kyawswa named Kumarakassapa on the throne.
A heavily armed Mongol army of 12,000 troops marched south, completely surrounding the brothers' heavily fortified city of Mayansang by January 25, 1301.
We have to look at the tactical evolution of the Burmese forces here. The brothers had thoroughly analyzed the disastrous mistakes made by the previous generation at the battles of Gasangyan and Kongsan.
They did not march their army out onto the open plains to meet the Mongols in a pitched battle.
They completely abandoned the use of war elephants, knowing they were a liability against massed archery.
Instead, they entrenched themselves in deep, complex, layered defensive works at Mayansang.
They engineered a brutal, grinding war of attrition. They knew they lacked the heavy cavalry to defeat the Mongol war machine in open combat.
But they also recognized the Mongols had a massive, exploitable vulnerability: the climate.
By refusing to engage, they forced the Mongols to lay a static siege.
This exposed the heavily armored Yuan army to the intense, rapidly rising heat of the approaching Burmese summer, the lack of sufficient fodder for their thousands of horses,
and the devastating spread of tropical diseases through their tightly packed siege camps.
Let us examine the logistics of this siege. For 3 grueling months, the Mongols battered the walls.
They utilized their engineering corps, but the defenses held.
The Mongol soldiers were exhausted, heavily demoralized, and dying in large numbers, not from Burmese arrows, but from heat stroke, dysentery, and malaria.
The offensive momentum completely stalled. And then, at the absolute height of the Mongols' logistical misery, the brothers deployed their most effective weapon: diplomacy in the form of a massive, undeniable bribe.
In April 1301, the Burmese commanders initiated secret negotiations with the Mongol leadership.
They offered the desperate, disease-ridden Mongol commanders an enormous amount of treasure gold, silver, and precious gems to simply pack up their camps and walk away.
The Mongol officers, recognizing that the siege was mathematically failing, that their men were dying of disease, and that taking the city would yield less wealth than the bribe sitting in front of them, accepted the terms.
They legally recognized the brothers' claim that the pagan royal lineage was effectively extinct, thus nullifying their mandate to install the puppet king.
And they began their total withdrawal on April 6th, completely breaking the siege.
It is a stunning, deeply cynical conclusion to decades of warfare. The Yuan government bureaucracy back in Yunnan was absolutely furious.
When the army returned, the imperial court executed the senior commanders for accepting the bribe and abandoning the mission.
But strategically, the Yuan court had to face the physical reality on the ground and admit defeat.
They recognized the sheer logistical futility of trying to project and maintain military power deep into the searing, hostile environment of the Irrawaddy Valley.
They launched no further invasions. In April 1303, the Mongols officially dissolved their administrative province in northern Burma and withdrew their military forces completely and permanently.
The Burmese had successfully pushed the Mongols out. It was a remarkable, hard-fought defensive victory built on logistical endurance and psychological warfare.
But the landscape they reclaimed was forever altered. The unified, massive empire of Pagan was gone forever.
To synthesize this entire conflict, the central takeaway is that the Mongol war machine did not, on its own, destroy Pagan.
It acted as a heavy sledgehammer to a structural foundation that was already hollowed out by profound economic imbalances, specifically the centuries-long hemorrhaging of taxable agricultural land to the religious establishment.
The three brothers managed to preserve Burmese sovereignty in the central dry zone, holding the defensive line through sheer logistical control at Myeongsang.
But the unified imperial pagan state was dead. This catastrophic collapse ushered in an era of severe political fragmentation, violently dividing the region into smaller, fiercely competing kingdoms for the next 250 years.
If we expand our view beyond the immediate political collapse in central Burma, there is a broader, massive geographical and demographic implication that reshaped the entire continent.
The Mongol military incursions into Yunnan and Burma did not just destroy field armies and burn fortresses, they violently displaced entire populations.
Kublai Khan's relentless campaigns forced mass, desperate migrations of the Taishan peoples out of their ancestral mountains in Yunnan and northern Burma,
Pushing them southward into the fertile river valleys of mainland Southeast Asia to escape the Mongol administration.
The Mongol military machine, in its attempt to secure a few border passes, inadvertently redrew the entire demographic map of the region.
Completely. This cascading domino effect of demographic displacement, sparked entirely by the Yuan dynasty's desire to secure its southern borders against the Song dynasty, ultimately laid the foundational populations for the emergence of the modern nations of Thailand and Laos.
The brutal border wars we discussed today did not merely end an ancient empire in Burma. They inadvertently seeded entirely new civilizations across the rest of the peninsula.
It is a striking reminder of how the violent shockwaves of history travel far beyond the immediate battlefield, reshaping human geography in ways the conquerors never intended.
A military campaign meant to secure the southern borders of China unintentionally redrew the ethnic and political map of mainland Southeast Asia forever.
That is a massive historical consequence to mull over. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.